Hi, my name's Kalela Williams. I'm the Director of Programming of One Book, One Philadelphia, and I'm going to talk today about The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon, which is the 2017 One Book, One Philadelphia featured selection. Now, if you're leading a book discussion on this book, you're going to have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to give you some insights as far as discussing this book. The plot of this book, a brief sort of outline of what this book is about. Of course, it's about a boy, Christopher Boon, who is 15 years old, and he's solving a neighborhood mystery and learning a little bit about himself and some secrets that maybe his family kept from him. So it's an interesting story. It's a very uplifting story. I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, the idea of mystery in this book. This is a detective novel. In fact, on page 4, Christopher Boon even says, "This is a murder mystery novel," and he goes on to say that he doesn't really like to read normal novels. He says something like, "Mostly I read books about science and maths. I do not like proper novels. In proper novels, people say things like, 'I am veined with iron, with silver, and streaks of common mud. I cannot contract into the firm fist which those clench who do not depend on stimulus.'" What does this mean? I do not know. I do not know either. Christopher goes on to say, "But I do like murder mystery novels, so I am writing a murder mystery novel." So that's very meta here, and that's something that you can discuss with your book club members. The idea that this throughout, he comments on the idea that he's writing something. So what we see, the novel that we're reading, is in a sense something that he's writing as we go along. So another thing is about this book is that Christopher very much identifies with the character Sherlock Holmes, who of course has been immortalized in movies and not just the original stories. On page 73 of this book, in fact, Christopher says, bear with me for a second, I do know how to count, I swear. So on page 73, Christopher talks about the Hound of the Baskervilles, which is a story in which 2 dogs are killed. In this book, only 1 dog is killed. But he talks about how he identifies with Sherlock Holmes. He doesn't really say that to an extent, but he takes a quote from Sherlock Holmes, saying, "Sherlock Holmes had, in a very remarkable degree, the power of detaching his mind at will. And he also says, the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes." So Christopher sort of sees himself in the character Sherlock Holmes, which is something that you could discuss among your book club members as well. So I want to talk a little bit more about Christopher's personality. One of the cruxes of this book is that Christopher has what he calls behavioral problems. And we'll see that on page 46. He actually makes a list of some of his behavioral problems, and he capitalizes that. And so some of them are things like screaming when I am angry or confused, or smashing things when I am angry or confused, groaning, not eating food if different parts of food are touching each other. So he has these different things, these different ways of behaving that he recognizes are different, and that he, to some extent, he recognizes that they are unacceptable to many other people, to most other people, and that he has to sort of correct them and know what they are and be able to identify them to not do them. So that's something that is interesting to talk about, again, among your book club memberships. One thing about this novel, a little bit of background, is that this novel has been both embraced by some members of the ASD community, and that is Autism Spectrum Disorder community, and in some ways members of the ASD community have found it controversial because they find that it promotes stereotypes. So that's something that you can discuss among your book club members. Mark Haddon, to speak about to sort of speak on his behalf, has always said that he did not intend this book to be about a character with ASD. He intended this book to be about a character who thinks differently and who perceives things differently. But again, it's up to, in many ways, the readership of this book has interpreted it in different ways. So that's something to talk about. Either way, Christopher, on page 14, he says something interesting that I certainly can relate to. Chapter 29 starts off, "I find people confusing." That's fair. So do I. I think many of us do. What Christopher finds especially confusing are facial expressions. He's really not able to sort of conceptualize facial expressions. In fact, in the very beginning of the novel, we see that one of his teachers gives expressions, she sort of draws expressions for him to be able to look at and perceive and understand. So if somebody's making a certain face, then he might understand that. Another thing that Christopher doesn't understand that is explained on page 14 are metaphors. Things like he mentions, I laughed my socks off. Well, what does that mean? Nobody laughs their socks off. Nobody literally laughs their socks off. If you say, I'm pulling your leg, are you? So again, Christopher doesn't quite understand metaphor, and he sees it as a lie. He sees metaphor as lying. And Christopher, interestingly enough, is a very genuine person, and he does not lie. On page 19, in fact, he talks about this. He says, I do not tell lies. He says, I cannot tell lies. It is because I can't tell lies. A lie is when you say something happened which didn't happen. But there is only ever one thing which happened at a particular time in a particular place. So he just doesn't even understand the concept of lying, which is interesting because most human beings, if you look at the research, most human beings actually lie. It's just something that we do. What Christopher is really good at, so he's not good at reading facial expressions, and he's not necessarily good at understanding metaphor, but what he is good at are numbers and spatial things and linear things. He makes lists. He's fascinated with math. On page 12, for instance, he talks about prime numbers, and he says prime numbers are what is left when you have taken all the patterns away. I think prime numbers are like life. They are very logical, but you could never work out all the rules, even if you spent all your time thinking about them. So this says a lot about how Christopher Boon conceptualizes things. And of course, we see that the chapters are in prime numbers. So that's another thing that you'll want to point out to your book club memberships. Of course, throughout the book, Christopher has dreams of taking his A-level maths course, and he wants to become a professor. So that's another thing to talk about. Again, the book is full of lists and puzzles and illustrations. I mean, if you just flip through it, you'll see just so many graphs and charts and lists, and here we are here, there's a puzzle, there's math equations, there's, again, a list, here's some sort of linear math equation, which I couldn't understand. That's not saying much, though. There's so much here, it's so much that's used to sort of conceptualize how Christopher Boon thinks, that it's not just with words, it's with everything. What I found especially poignant was on page 169 to 170, where, and I don't want to give too much away about what happens in the book, but he's going on a trip, he's going on an adventure, an unintended adventure, which is very, I shouldn't even call it an adventure. It's actually, it's quite a journey for him, and it's very scary for him. And he sees signs in a train station in the underground in London, and he is just completely overwhelmed. And so we see the way that the signs should look, and then we see that sort of everything just starts blurring together, and it becomes just this mess. And I find that, again, especially poignant. And again, those are pages 169 and 170. So that's something that you could talk about with your book club membership. So some other things to take away from this novel. What are the mysteries of this novel? Is it who killed the dog? Is it why Christopher's family kept secrets away from him? Is it why the way that people are thinking is sometimes at odds with what they say? What are the levels of empathy of this novel? Christopher's empathy with others, Christopher's empathy with animals. What about the adults in his life? How do they empathize with him? And how does Christopher, or does he empathize with himself? Another question to ask. Christopher Boon thinks differently from many of us, of course, as we discussed. Do you feel that our society has been constructed to consider thinkers like Christopher, or do you feel that it hasn't been? And what ways of thinking do we value, and what ways of Christopher's way of thinking, how does that add? How does that add to our world? And we've all had moments, of course, where people just aren't getting us. Maybe consider a moment like that and talk about that among your book's readership. And then the last thing is, what would your life be like if you never lied? So that's another thing to think about. One last thing I want to leave with is that many people ask about the title of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, and that is actually taken from a Sherlock Holmes story. And if you have a one-book calendar of events, and I encourage you to get one because it has over 100 events and activities that are happening, and this is available all around your library system, but inside you'll see, if I can flip this over, you'll see a curious fact. And that is that the title of the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime was taken from the Sherlock Holmes short story, A Silver Blaze, in which a Scotland Yard detective asked, is there any other point to which you would wish to draw my attention? And Holmes says, to the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. And Gregory says, the detective says, the dog did nothing in the nighttime. And Holmes says, that was the curious incident. Thank you, and good luck discussing this book, and I hope you enjoy.